Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining lesson number 24 from the Spring Security Fundamentals stream. We are here to discuss now the difference between roles and authorities and then step into matcher methods, which is the continuation of our previous lessons of this stream, of course. If you are watching the event live, don't forget that I have a live chat there, so you can ask me questions directly in the live chat. If you are not watching the event live, if you just see the recording, then you can still ask questions in the comment section, and let's have a great discussion also on LinkedIn or Twitter. And of course, I will try to answer your questions as fast as possible in a separate video or in the next lesson. So let's continue with today's lesson by sharing my desktop and creating a new project as usual. I still see here I have my project from the previous lesson, so let's create a new one. We'll simply add the web dependency, and remember that we have finished with discussing the basics of everything that is authentication. We have discussed basic authentication, form login, OAuth. We have discussed plenty of things about how this can be configured with Spring Security, and now what we discuss further is the authorization part. So what we discuss here in terms of configuration of the authorization applies to all the authentication configurations we have learned previously during this stream. And of course, at some point I will show you how this works with different authentication styles, but for the moment I will just continue with using HTTP basics, so I allow you focus on authorization, and I almost completely take out authentication. And then of course in one of the next videos you will see how to also use it with an OAuth app, and of course with a reactive application, and then we will discuss as well about testing both authentication and authorization. So in today's lesson and in these first lessons where we discuss authorization, I'd like you to focus on how to configure authorization, and that's why I don't want for the moment to use another authentication method, but I will do so in the next lesson. So in the end, as I have promised you from the very beginning, you will have a complete overview of everything that means fundamentals of Spring Security in terms of configuring your apps for both authentication and authorization. That being said, as I said, let's create a new project, and I use Spring Initializer as usual. And this is the Spring Security lesson number 24. I said I can use Java 11, Java 14, doesn't really matter in our case here, will not be affected a lot by this decision. And yes, we need at least the web dependency and Spring Security for the time being, so we only need to add for the moment these dependencies for the things that we'll present today. Next, and then and then finish, and then I want just to replace this window, so let me open it in this window, and that's it. We have the project. I think everything was downloaded from my needed dependencies, and we can just implement, as always, a very small endpoint that I can use to validate my assumptions. And once I create a very basic configuration for authentication that you've learned how to do up from the starting with actually lesson 1 of this stream, then we discuss the first important topic of today, and that is authorities versus roles. So this is what we want to do. So let's simply create a very small controller to prove our example. I create a new package controller, and then I create a hello controller or demo controller or whatever you'd like to call it. So that's a REST controller, and then let's say it's public string hello, which will be a get mapping and will return a string. And then of course the next important thing we need to work on is the configuration. So I create a configuration package in which I will simply write a configuration class, project config, to be a configuration class, I need to annotate it with @configuration. And you know that the very basic things we always need is in case of authentication, of course, is a user detail service and the password encoder. So let's add our user detail service here, and then our password encoder. And we have, as you have seen, multiple ways to configure this, but I will just create it as a bin in the context, because already in the very in the latest Spring Boot versions, Spring Security is already configured by Spring Boot to take these bins from the context, as you again have seen me doing in the previous videos as well. So we need a memory user details manager here as an implementation, and then I for the moment would like to only create one user. So let's use the simple user builder with username. I can call it John, and then I say it actually needs a password, which will be 12345, and it needs authorities. And this is for the moment, I start with only saying authorities, and then we compare authorities with roles. So say it has authority read, and then I build this user. I added it to be managed by my in-memory user details manager, and then I return this user details manager, which will take the role of the user details service in case of my application. So it will be used by Spring Security to retrieve the user details. And then nothing will work if I don't actually add also a password encoder. And again, to make it easy for you, I still use that no password encoder. Remember, this is something you never use in a real world scenario. That's why it's marked as deprecated, and that's why you can see it's striked out by IntelliJ and by any decent IDE, because it's marked deprecated, and that's because it doesn't hash the password. So you have to never use this in real world scenarios. I was actually amused to see a question on Stack Overflow recently about something to use instead of the no password encoder, that somebody was asking, what can I use instead of the no password encoder that is not deprecated and it doesn't encode the password? And I was something like, well, you can use the no password encoder, there's no problem. The reason for why it's marked deprecated is because it doesn't encode the password, and you shouldn't use that in a real world scenario. So yeah, that was some kind of a question, but that's why I try to do these videos for you friends, to know these things and hopefully understand all these basics of this framework the way they should be. So don't use this in a real world scenario. We use it here because it's only an example and we can spare time with using the no password encoder, but it doesn't hash the password, it doesn't encrypt the password. That's why it's marked as deprecated, and that's why in a real world scenario you shouldn't use it. And now, of course, it won't be it wouldn't be a video about authorization if we don't discuss authorization. So to continue with our implementations, what you need to do is extend the web security configure adapter, and of course override your desired configure method, in which we will write the endpoint security configuration. Now I'd like to go back a little bit to what I've told you in the previous lesson. If you remember, we have classified these authorization rules, these authorization configurations, into endpoint configurations. So that's what we are doing here. That's what we've been doing also in the previous lesson. We configure the rules for authorization at the endpoint level. They will be taken directly at the filter level by Spring Security. So Spring Security intercepts the request in its filter chain that we've already discussed in this stream previously, and it applies the rules that you define here in the configure method. Lately, in the next lessons, we will discuss the other option, the other classification we've done for the authorization rules that are at the method level. So we have a second option that we'll discuss in the next lessons regarding applying the authorization rules at different layers of your application using global method security. But that's something else. It's still part of the authorization, but it's the other classification we've done. So we'll take them step by step. We first discuss the way you apply the authorization rules at the endpoint level, and then you need to implement the to know how to implement also the authorization rules at the method level. So thank you very much, glad to see you also, and that you are so many already here with me still. Yeah, so I was here just trying to override my method, the configure method of HTTP security. This is it, and I do state as a first thing here that I'd like to still use HTTP basic. Remember that we start with HTTP basic, but then I will show you in one of the next lessons how you apply it also in an OAuth 2 resource server. So no worries for the moment, just worry for understanding the way these authorization rules work. And then of course I say authorized requests, because that's what we try to do now. So that's why you see when we continue with writing the authorization rules, you first from the HTTP security object you call authorized requests. That's what is telling you from now on what you do is implementing authorization configurations, and then now you do the authorization configurations. And remember that in all of the cases of the previous lesson we have used the any request matcher method. I'll explain why this is called the matcher method lately in this lesson. But what we importantly discussed is that we have these options now to apply the rules which are has authority, has any authority, has role, has any role, and then you also have an access method that we will discuss as well, which is same part of the methods you use to specify the roles. So I maybe will add them here in a comment to make the things easier for you to find them later. So you have the has authority, the has any authority, has role, has any role. So you see these two are very similar. We have a has authority and a has role. We have a has any authority and has any role, and then you have an access as well, which is a little bit different. It uses Spring expression language expressions to define the rules. That's why we'll discuss this only at the end. Anyway, as I will tell you, you will prefer to use actually one of these, and in some situations these are not powerful enough, and then you have to fall back to using the access method. But in most of the cases it's recommended that you use one of these methods and avoid using the access as much as possible. Only when it's not possible to avoid using the access method, then you should go and use the access method. And you have already seen how to use the has authority method in the previous lesson. So now let's continue with what is called a role, and then let's make a comparison between what authority is and what a role is. So instead here of using the access method for the moment, I use the has a role method, and I will say, okay, let's say I has role admin. Okay, in this case what I've done here won't make any sense, because in my case my only user doesn't have any role. So a role is very much similar to an authority. It's just a difference of the concept itself from the logic point of view, that an authority is an action and a role is a badge. So when you say, for example, you want the user to refer, you want the authorization rules to refer to allowing the user to do some actions, and your application is action based, like read, write, delete, execute, whatever. So when you have an action and you define actions and your authorization rules are based on these actions, then you use authorities. The authorities is fine-grained action, and it enables you configure your authorization rules based on the actions. In a lot of applications, however, we don't necessarily refer directly to actions. We refer to some roles, some badges that we apply to the users. And we say this user is an admin, or this user is a manager, or this user is something that has a meaning in your application. Of course, in our example here, it doesn't really need to have a meaning, but in your application, you know when you say I have an admin, you know what an admin is. When you say I have a client, you know what a client is. When you say I have a manager, you know what manager means in your application. But whenever you do apply badges, it's better to refer to these badges as roles. And that, in the terms of implementing the authorization rules, usually the badges refer to group of permissions which are strictly the same all the time. So you always know, for example, that the admin is able to read, write, and delete, but the manager is only able to read and write, and then you have a specific very small permissive kind of user that only has a read access. In this case, instead of adding the authority to your user, you will actually add a role to your user, and you will say my user has an admin role, or whatever the roles you have. And a user can have multiple badges, same as authorities. You can actually give multiple roles to your user, but the difference is at the logic of it. In the difference is between actually having an action, fine-grained action, or having a badge that represents that user and the capabilities of that user. So you see in my case here, what I've changed from what I've shown you in the previous lesson is that now, instead of using an authority, I define a role. So you see I have a role, I made it admin, it really doesn't matter what that means in our case, it's just a role, take it as it is. And I say that any kind of request, that means for any endpoint and any HTTP method, because that's the only thing we've learned up to now in this stream, to call that endpoint, you need to have an admin role. So what can we do to prove that this is working is actually we can create two users. Let's say we have Bill and John. We have two different roles that we assign to them. We make them managed by the user details service that we have. I start the application and I try to call the hello endpoint using both these users, using either of these users, and we should see that only John is able to actually call the hello endpoint, because that's what I have set here in my authorization rules, where I've said any request you've done, you try to do, you need to have the admin role, otherwise it won't work. So that's basically what we expect, how we expect it to work. And I wait for my app to start, and then I have a postman here, and I will try to make the call as I promised. So my application started, postman here, I create a new tab, and then I say HTTP localhost 8080 hello, and as authorization we have basic authorization, and we need to fill up first, it's John, password is 12345 if I remember correctly, and then you see it's a 200, okay, and you see a hello, and then I replace John with Bill, and I send the request again, but for Bill it will be a 4034 forbidden. And that's because, of course, that's expected. Bill doesn't have the proper role to be able to call the endpoint, because it has the role manager, but we stated in our authorization rule that it needs to be an admin to call any endpoint of this application. So yeah, it works correctly. In terms of the implementation, and that's important for you to know, because I've seen so many people making confusions, thinking that this is basically something else defining the role there. Well, you'll find it maybe strange to hear that both roles and authorities, they are defined by the same contract in Spring Security, and that contract is a contract we've seen in the previous lessons. Actually, we've seen it from the very first lesson of this stream, is the granted authority interface. The granted authority interface, I'll write it here. The granted authority is the interface representing both the authorities or the roles. And if you go to the user details contract, again, a contract that you have learned about in the very first lesson of this stream, you remember the user details contract is the contract used by Spring Security to represent the user. You won't see anything related to roles here. See, you don't have, and I just opened the interface so that you, as a refresher for you, so that you remind how it looks like. And remember that you have no roles in here. You have those username and password. You have the authorities, which, be careful, these are the granted authorities representing both authorities or roles. I will take that it is recommended to use role admin for the moment. Let me explain this and I will go back. It's not recommended, it's actually mandatory, and it's what happened, but I will explain you immediately that one with the role admin. So we have the username, we have the password, we have the granted authority, which represents both authorities and roles, and then we have 4 methods that are related to authorization, and they are basically related to account being able to expire, be locked, and so on and so forth. We don't care now for them. So the granted authority is the interface that represents both the admin and the both the role and the authorization. Now I go to your statement. I'm not sure if I know how to pronounce your name, so sorry for that, but I will say Jay. Jay, I go to your statement. It is recommended to use role admin instead of admin. That's basically what we are doing here. And you'll say, what? I don't see any role before that. How can you say use role admin? Well, let me show you some magic. I'm going into these roles, and what you will basically see is that Spring Security actually automatically adds for me that role underscore before the admin. So what I actually use here is role admin, and if I would actually try to do that myself, if I would actually try to say role underscore admin here, it won't start. It will actually crash with an exception, because roles, this method, is defined to already use that role underscore. So your statement is true. It is indeed recommended that the roles are named with role underscore. It's not only recommended, it's what it should happen. And but in my case, because I've added the roles method, and that was what I tried to explain now, it's automatically adding this prefix in front of my admin. So that's what I do here. So you see, if I try to edit myself, it says no, you cannot start with role underscore, because roles already does that for you. So that's why in my case I've only used admin. And going back a little bit to our roles method that I have used here, you'll see something very interesting. First of all, you'll see that indeed it tests that you didn't specify yourself the prefix, which is what it's supposed to be. Then it simply creates a simple granted authority, which is an object of type granted authority, which proves precisely what I was telling you a little bit earlier, that roles in the end are still nothing else than objects of type granted authority, objects that represent the granted authority that are represented by the granted authority contract. And you've probably seen this simple granted authority as well, because it's that very basic class we use to define authorities. It only actually takes a name. If you see, with name is final and is mandatory, because anyway any authority should have a name. And yeah, that's what a role is. Why? Okay, I have 2 questions. Let me see. First of all, it is recommended to implement user details in the user domain entity. No, that's something that I have explained. From my perspective, no, that's something that I have explained in one of the previous lessons. I'd recommend you to review on the same channel. You will find this is lesson 24, so you have 23 more lessons about Spring Security already registered and free to access for you. when you implement the user details from your entity, your JPA entity, for example, or whatever entity you use to define also the database, you, from my point of view, add two responsibilities to that class. And remember, in solid principles, we have that single responsibility principle that recommends you to keep your classes to have only one responsibility. So I recommend you decouple that and try to use either a decorator, either some other approach in which you decouple this and you don't have the user details contract implemented by your entity. And this is something, again, if you go back, you will find it explained better than now. Now it was a short explanation for you, and I hope at least it answered your concern. But if you want to see a better example, you'll actually find it in one of the previous lessons where I have explained and implemented my own JPA user details service, and I used JPA to take the user details from the database. Now, why do we need roll underscore prefix at all? Because when it's basically the only way in which you make a difference between authority and role in Spring Security. As I've just told you, you don't have different contracts. The granted authority interface is the interface representing both the roles and the authorities. So if you want to somehow mark the fact that in your application you don't refer to actions but you refer to badges, then you use this role underscore prefix, and that's actually the way say the best practice, a good practice to do is to represent the role and say a role. You don't make it authority, you just make an authority and its name starts with role underscore prefix, and that's a badge. So take it as a I don't know, not necessarily a rule, but a good to do. So that's why now I have how we deal with a resource server that has a key cloak authorization server. I just need to set the JW the code, my access token, and he will do the magic. Yes, but if you will actually search in one of the previous lessons, maybe 20 something, I have actually created an example with a key cloak and the resource server. So check it out because it's implemented had to fit, and you can simply just see how I configure my key cloak and how I use it. So it's already there in a previous lesson. I think if you search for key cloak on my channel, you will find that video, and I hope that one will answer. Yeah, it's an hour video where I do that, so it will basically hopefully answer your question about key cloak and configuring your resource server. Okay, perfect. And I think these were the questions for now. So where was I? Actually, I was explaining that you have granted authority, which is the only contract representing both authorities and roles, and the only difference between authorities and roles is the concept. One of them is an action, the other one is a badge, and then for the badge you have to add the role underscore. But actually, if you use the role method, as I've done here, because some of you asked me why didn't I add the role underscore, is because this method actually does that for you. So you can't even do that because Spring Security tests that, and if you try to put yourself the role underscore, then it won't work. What you can do, however, is instead of roles, if you really want, you can use authorities. But then if you do that, then you have to manually add the role underscore prefix in front of the admin. So you can do like this, and basically if I run now the application, say role admin and role manager, what happens is that I have the precisely same behavior. I didn't change anything, because a role is nothing more than an authority with the role underscore prefix in front of it, representing like this the badge, a badge and not an action. So that's why in this case, when I run the application now, if I run the application now, so this will precisely work as when I was using the roles method, because the roles method doesn't do anything special. It only creates an authority with the role underscore prefix. And if I won't change here, it will still stay with a has role. And you will see that basically this works the same. So Bill can't access, but John is able to access because it has the role. So this is how I actually prove you that a role is basically a simply granted authority object with the role underscore prefix. And this is how Spring Security sees this as a role, and that in terms, in logical terms, it represents a badge. It's a badge you apply to the user and not an action. That's why when you use authorities, you usually use verbs like read, write, delete, something, something, something. It's a verb always, or it contains a verb. While in the case of a badge, you usually have something that characterizes the user, like admin or manager. It's not a verb, it's not an action. So I hope with this I have also answered you with role underscore. The difference, if you want to have it on my my GitHub account, I can actually leave it to you like this, so you can see here the difference easy. So this is actually, I can comment it here. This is actually role admin. This is equivalent to say role admin, and this is basically equivalent to saying an authority role underscore manager. So this is basically it. You see the difference? They are simply just granted authorities, but when you do have a role, you have a role underscore in front. Be very careful, however, when you use it. So that's when you define it. When you define it, if you define it as an authority yourself, then you have to be careful to add the prefix. If you use the role, then the roles method does that for you, as I've shown you. But when you use it, you don't use it with the prefix. When I say has role, observe I didn't add a prefix here. So when I say has role admin, Spring Security knows that it needs to find an authority with the role underscore prefix. And you've seen that my authorization rule worked very well, and I didn't have to specify the role underscore. And if I actually would go and add the prefix here, it won't work anymore as expected. So when you refer to the role, you still refer to it without that role underscore prefix. That role underscore prefix is only for Spring Security to know that that granted authority is not an action but a badge. But when you use it in your absolutely any kind of authorization rules, you still refer to the role without the prefix. Good. So that's with roles versus authorities, and hopefully I was clear with this, and that enables us to go to the next subject of today's video, and that's most probably a subject that I feel I won't be able to just finish it today. And that's the matcher methods, which is really important because it will tell you how to apply different authorization rules to different requests. So I see another question. Instead of has role admin, can we use the method roles allowed admin? Very good question, Bogdan. Thank you very much. When you use the roles allowed admin, which basically is an annotation borrowed from Java Enterprise Edition, it's one of the specification requests from Java that have implemented that a long time ago. You use what we call the method security, which in terms of Spring Security, plain Spring Security, non-reactive, is also called the global method security. So remember at the beginning of the today's lesson, we have classified these authorization rules into two, and I said we have one endpoint authorization rules, and that's what we are doing here, and this too is the second one that we'll discuss in one of the future lessons, called the method or global method security. So method security is sometimes known as the global method security. So that's where you have roles allowed, the roles allowed annotation, you have the pre and post authorize annotations, You have the pre and post filter annotations, and you have also an annotation name secured. So that this is what's part of the method security. So to answer your question, it's not instead of the has role. When you do use the roles allowed or any of these annotations here, which are all part of what we call method security, you just implement the authorization rules in a different fashion, and that's at the method level. And as we'll discuss in one of the future lessons, you have the possibility, first of all, to apply some rules at the endpoint level, and they are treated at the filter level, so that the difference between these 2 points, and you will hear me repeating that also in the next lessons because it's important. When you configure these rules here, this one, which is this kind that we discussed now, this is applied at the filter chain level. So when the filter chain intercepts the HTTP request, it applies the rules that you have defined here in one of the filters in the chain, while in this case, in the case of the method security, which includes the roles allowed and all the other annotations, these are interpreted after the request is accepted at an aspect, an AOP, an aspect defined by Spring that intercepts the annotations. And it's quite a difference between applying the authorization rules at the filter level and at the method level. And we will discuss more details about this also in the future lessons. It's a lot to discuss about this. But what I wanted to make sure you understand is that it's not the same thing. It might apply the same rule, but it's not the same thing in terms of implementation and in terms of, yeah, we can call here also performance, we can call maintainability of the application. Again, but we'll discuss all these details, more details in the future lessons. Also, when we start touching the method security subject, because for the moment we only discuss about the authorization rules. Thank you also. Okay, good, cool. Thank you very much for the question again. And with that being said, let's go to the matcher methods. Again, I was saying that matcher methods is also a big subject. I don't expect I will finish it now, but I expect I can at least show you what a matcher method is. And then I'd like you to know from the beginning that we'll discuss about actually 3 kinds of matcher methods that we have available. It's the MVC matcher, the ANT matcher, and you have the regex matcher as well. I would most likely like to focus on the MVC matcher methods, which are the most important, but I will also make a very good comparison between MVC matchers and ANT matchers, because I see a lot of people using ANT matchers nowadays without understanding some very important differences, which might be might introduce vulnerabilities to your application. So it's really important that you know them. And then only at the end I will explain very roughly regex, because that's something that I will basically recommend you avoid using, and using only if you don't have any other choice. The regex matchers offer you a very powerful tool to use regex expressions, regular expressions, to refer to the paths to which you want to apply the authorization rules, but we'll discuss them later. So now I will continue on this example, and to prove the first use, the most easy example of using the matcher methods, let's just create in our hello controller another method representing another endpoint, say ciao like in Italian, and let's add one more, but this time I'd like it to be a post mapping. I say like in hola, like in Spanish. Somebody told me that I don't have the reverse here. You know, in Spanish it should have the reverse exclamation mark, but I don't have it on my keyboard, so allow me keep it like this. I know it's not perfect, but I will skip adding that because I don't have time to search for it. And now why did I actually add three? Why did I add two more methods here? Why do I need three endpoints? Is because what we do with matcher methods is we define authorization rules per endpoint, and per actually request is better to say, not necessarily endpoint. When I refer endpoint, I think about path plus the HTTP method. So whenever you hear me about discussing about endpoints, in my case I refer to endpoint, I say the endpoint is path plus the HTTP method. So you can say, for example, you have slash hello called with get, that's different than slash hello called with post, that's different than slash chow called with get, and so on and so forth. So when you say request or an endpoint, in my mind, I don't only think about the path. I don't want to confuse you. It's not only the path, it's the path plus the HTTP method. Yeah, precisely, that's the one. Ola, yeah, I should have actually added this exclamation. I'm not sure if I can actually copy it from here. So let me see. Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure if it will work, but yeah, that should be the correct one. Thank you very much. that's how I should have written it from the beginning. Good. And now what I'd like to do, because what I have here, I have three endpoints, meaning a hello with get, a ciao with get, and an hola with post. And when I go back to my authorization rules, what I see is that I have used this any request, and this is how we've started on in the previous lesson. Any request means it doesn't matter how you call the endpoint, what endpoint you call, what HTTP method, and what path should it be. It's always this rule that applies. But in real world scenarios, it's not working like that. In real world scenarios, you rarely, and I would actually say never, find situations in which you have this rule applies to all the endpoints. You basically want to have endpoints for which you apply some rules, other endpoints for which you apply some different rules, and maybe want to exclude any other endpoint or permit any other endpoint at some point. Okay. So here we have authorization resources both in the same projects when we need to have different story. How to restrict the endpoint based on roles. Well, role is basically the same thing. I'm not precisely sure what happens when you have both authorization server and resource server in the same application. We can try that in a future lesson. I don't precisely know because, and I'm not sure because, as I've told you in the previous lessons, it's better to avoid having the two responsibilities into the same app, but you basically should be able to apply the authorization rules the same way I prove you here. In one of the future lessons I will show you how to do with a resource server, and then we can, of course, if you'd like, we can as a bonus take both responsibilities, put them in an app and see if we can configure the authorization rules. But let's keep it for another lesson so that we can focus now step by step on how to apply the rules. So I have created three endpoints and I wanted to apply different rules. I want to say, for example, that if you'd like to call hello, you need to be, say, an admin. And if you want to call the ciao, you need to be a manager. And for hola, you can call it whatever you only say need to be authenticated. We can say only by being authenticated. You don't need to have any special badge to call the hola endpoint. So say, can we actually implement this kind of rules this way? And yeah, the answer should be yes, we can do that, because that's basically what matchers method do. And we have, in terms of matcher methods, again, we have three kinds. We have the MVC matchers, we have the ANT matchers, and we have the regex. Okay, and I won't focus now on the differences among these three. I will just take the first one, the MVC matchers, and I will try to apply the rules, because I want you to have an example straightforward. And then we discuss details on how to apply the rules, and you will see also the differences between these matchers. So for my MVC matchers, I have the possibility to apply an MVC match. I have the possibility to actually just call the MVC matchers method, and if you'd like to refer to exclude an HTTP method and just say the path, just apply on the path regardless of the HTTP method, then you simply just add the patterns here for which you want to apply the rule. And I can say, for example, for hello, you need to have the role admin. And then I can say for ciao, you need to be a manager. And for any other request that will of course include the OLA, you just need to be authenticated. We don't test the roles. So any user, as long as it's authenticated, will be able to call this endpoint. I could have, for example, just allowed everyone without authentication. Remember, we've discussed in the previous lesson about permit all, which we would enable anyone call the OLA endpoint without even needing to have a user. Or I could have actually denied all the requests. I would say deny all the requests for any other endpoint, that is OLA in this case, would not be able to be called by anyone. And for the moment, let's keep it authenticated. For this example, it's enough if we just say it's authenticated, and then I will just restart my application and let's try to test and see what happens. Let's try to just call these endpoints with different users. We have a couple of users here. One is an admin, the other one is a manager, and I'd like to see what's the behavior when calling my endpoints with either one of these users. So my application started. I'm going to hello, and I say I'd like to call hello with John, and it seems that hello can be called with John, which I think is according to my rules. So I say you need to be an admin to call the hello endpoint, and John is an admin, so John can call the hello endpoint. And I try to say call the hello endpoint using the user Bill. I'm not sure what happens here, but it's something very strange. Bill, okay. And then you see we have a 403 forbidden because the authorization rule states that you need to be an admin to call the hello endpoint, and Bill is a manager. So Bill cannot call hello, but John can call the hello endpoint. However, if you turn this endpoint into ciao, then you will see that you will get precisely the opposite behavior. Bill, who is a manager, is able to call the ciao endpoint. But if I try to call the ciao endpoint using John, who is an admin, in my case, I say the admin cannot call the ciao endpoint because you need to be a manager, and only a manager can call endpoint ciao. But if you'd like to call OLA, then of course, and OLA was post, so be careful, it was a post call, then you should be able to call it with John and Bill, and now I'm not sure why I can't. but this is strange. I should be able to. Oh, sorry, it's a post endpoint, and it has CSRF protection, of course, enabled. So now, because I don't want to discuss CSRF, we discussed CSRF in one of the previous lessons, let's just disable it, because if you don't disable it, then it won't work. So I have disabled the cross-site request forgery protection. Remember, for any post, delete, and so on, endpoint Spring Security applies the cross-site request forgery protection, and that's why I wasn't able to call the OLA endpoint. So let's try it again. So you see now I'm able, and you see it's also with the nice exclamation mark here. So you see Bill and John can both call the OLA endpoint. Okay, so that's how my authorization rule work. Can we add a role based on the username? based on the username. I'm not sure what you want precisely. Well, you can maybe you want to say not a role. Maybe you want to say can we add a rule, not a role, a rule, an authorization rule based on the username. I guess that's the question, because the role is something independent. You can actually add roles and authorities however you'd like. You can have each username with its own role if you'd like. You can use the username as a role. So you probably refer to the rule here. So in case of the username, yes, you can do that, but you have to implement a custom permission, and we will deal with that in one of the next lessons, because first of all, it doesn't work on it can work on the endpoint level as well, but you need to use that access method I've discussed a little bit earlier, and I said we will discuss later because it's much more complicated. Or you can do that with the method security that I said we'll take in one of the future lessons, and for that you would implement a custom permission. So yes, you can do that, but we will deal with this aspect because it's a little bit more complicated in the next example, probably in the next lessons. So how do you debug your Spring Security apps? I implemented an authorization code flow. Okay, it works fine in the unit test, but I get 401 on Postman. I'm new to debugging Spring Security apps. That's a very good question, actually. How do we actually how can we debug Spring Security? Well, one possibility, one of them, but I avoid it as much as possible, and I'll show you why, is adding the logging level here. So specify logging level, for example, for either specific packages, either root, and then you make your logging level as fine grained as possible. But when you will do this, you will basically see a lot of logs. It might sometimes help you, however, because it gives you some idea on which is the filter or which is the aspect that rejected your call, like in your case 401. So you will see, for example, here, let me now start with the debug active. And you see significantly here more logs. And then say I'd like to call the hello endpoint using Bill, and you know that should give me a 403, so forbidden. And then I go back and I try to see here, say where precisely do I have my rejection. It says it went to the error, and then I try to see who did that, and I try to see looking here at the classes. And then what I can do, one thing that I can try to do, is to simply add a breakpoint in a specific class where I see that a specific exception was thrown. And when you do that, you will be able to then follow on to just follow on the stack of the method and see where the problem comes from. So yeah, for example, you can just say take this one for the moment. It usually takes some time, so I'm not sure if I can now just find it properly with you, but I give you an idea on how to do that. So you find a class, for example, this end path request matcher that I've seen in the logs that it created my problem. I add a breakpoint, for example, on the first line of the matches method. That is what I actually expect it might be called. And then I use debug mode, and I just debug on Spring Security, which fortunately is open source, and that enables you to see the code and even debug the code whenever you need that. So you see I'm now going back again, and you see that indeed my application stopped in the breakpoint, and then from here I start an investigation. So from here I just go on the stack, and I see what might have happened, what in which filter am I, what's the problem, what's the possible problem, and I try to find the solution. So that's when I really don't know where the problem comes from. That's how I do usually. I try to debug on the Spring Security itself. So first step you might find useful is to add the debug level here, so that it gives you a clue from where the exception or where the rejection comes from, and then from there you can start using breakpoints and debugging your application. Fortunately for me, in most of the cases I just find the problem just looking on the code quite easy, because I've worked a lot with them. But I know that Spring Security can be complicated, and you might need to debug on it at some point, because yeah, you just simply don't know where the problem comes from. That's basically how I'm doing when I have no other hope. So when there's no more hope for me, I'm just adding the debug level, and then I place breakpoints and I start to debug and see where is my request rejected. In this case, of course, it's clear for me why it's rejected, because Bill cannot call the hello endpoint, being that it doesn't have the correct role. See, Bill is a manager, and in order to call the hello endpoint you need to be an admin. I hope that answered your question on how I debug my Spring Security applications. And that gives you today an idea of what a matcher method is. I know we didn't discuss matcher methods, but I was expecting from the very beginning of this lesson that we won't be able to actually discuss everything about matcher methods. However, what I want you to remember from this lesson is that a matcher method is that method that enables you to specify to which requests you will apply a specific rule. And that's very useful in real world scenarios, because in general you don't have an authorization rule for all the requests. You need to have different configurations, different authorization configurations per request, and sometimes this will be on the HTTP method. So maybe you want to say that the endpoints called with get should be different than the endpoints called with post, or based on the path. So you will have these situations where you either have configuration rules different on path, either on the HTTP method, either on a combination of the path and the HTTP method. So that's why we learn the matchers methods, because they enable us apply the configurations. And with that being said, for today's lesson I will end, because we don't have any time for any more example. But in the next lesson we will continue with making more, creating more examples and trying the MVC matchers, the AND matchers, discussing the differences between MVC and AND matchers, and then of course I'd like to show you also how to use at least have an example with a regex matcher. And then when we've finished with this, then the next thing we'd like to discuss, of course, is using method level security, and that's the place where we'll discuss the roles allowed annotation. But actually I mostly, as I will show you, I will discuss mostly the pre and post authorized and filter annotations, because they are more important for Spring implementations than roles allowed and secured. But we'll discuss in the end about everything that is global method security. So let's stop here today. Thank you very much for all your questions. You've been, as always, very active again in the live chat, and that's awesome. And you've asked some pretty nice questions. And I hope to see you also in the next lesson to continue with our examples on authorization. Until then, have a great time for learning.